In 2015, Michael Shaver, a 49-year-old man from Michigan, was reported missing by his wife, Lori Shaver. Michael's disappearance seemed baffling at first. Lori told authorities that her husband had left their home without warning, leaving behind his belongings, including his phone, wallet, and keys. She claimed that Michael had been going through some personal struggles and simply walked out one day, choosing not to say goodbye. This explanation, however, quickly raised suspicions among investigators. Michael's family and friends, particularly his brother, Mark Grayson, were not convinced by Lori's account. They found it hard to believe that Michael, a man who had always been close to his family, would disappear without a trace and leave his belongings behind. His absence felt out of character. Mark was the first to speak up, questioning the story Lori had given. He couldn't reconcile the image of Michael as a devoted brother and uncle with the idea that he would just walk away from his life. Lori's behavior was equally perplexing. During the investigation, she remained composed, almost eerily so. She spoke about Michael in a matter-of-fact tone, offering no signs of the distress one would expect from a wife whose husband had just vanished. As days passed, Lori maintained that Michael had left on his own accord, choosing to start over and leave behind everything: his family, his life, and his responsibilities. Neighbors, however, were just as confused. No one had seen Michael leave, and no one had noticed any signs of a struggle. Lori's calm demeanor in the face of the disappearance only fueled the suspicion that she knew more than she was letting on. Why had Michael left? What had happened in their home that made him walk away so abruptly? Was Lori telling the truth, or was there something darker at play? Mark, who had always been close to his brother, grew increasingly suspicious. He couldn't shake the feeling that Lori wasn't being honest, and as he delved deeper into his brother's life, he uncovered more unsettling details. Michael hadn't just disappeared. There were signs pointing to a much more sinister reality. Lori's claims began to fall apart as inconsistencies emerged, and the investigation turned from a missing person case to something far more complex. Detective Monroe, assigned to the case, began his investigation by looking into the family's background. He was struck by Lori's odd behavior, her lack of emotion, her repeated insistence that Michael had left on his own terms. But the detective knew that the truth, however hidden, would eventually come to light. Lori's calmness was only the first red flag in a case that would soon unravel in ways no one could have expected. The more Monroe dug, the more he uncovered about Lori's past and the dark secrets that had been lurking just beneath the surface. The search for Michael was just beginning, but it was clear that Lori's story wasn't adding up. With every passing day, the truth seemed further out of reach. But one thing was becoming clear. Lori's involvement in her husband's disappearance was growing harder to ignore. Detective Monroe's initial investigation into Michael Shaver's disappearance was unsettling, but as he began to dig deeper, the cracks in Lori's story started to widen. Lori's calm, almost detached demeanor while speaking about her husband's disappearance struck Monroe as odd. It was clear she wasn't acting like someone whose spouse had just vanished. The first step in the investigation was to trace Michael's last known movements. His friends, family, and co-workers were questioned. Everyone spoke highly of Michael. He was a dedicated worker, a loving brother to Mark, and a reliable friend. No one had any indication that he would just abandon his life. Yet Lori's story remained consistent. Michael had left voluntarily, intending to start anew. But as the interviews continued, something didn't sit right with Detective Monroe. It wasn't long before the first piece of evidence came to light. Monroe learned that Lori had been in contact with Michael's lawyer just days before his disappearance. She had been inquiring about Michael's will, specifically asking about his life insurance policy and whether she was the sole beneficiary. That seemed unusual. If Michael had truly walked away from everything, why was Lori already thinking about financial matters? Monroe's instincts told him that something was off. The detective paid a visit to the Shaver home, hoping to find something that would further explain Michael's sudden disappearance. As he walked through the house, he noticed small things that didn't make sense. Michael's clothes were still hanging in the closet, his favorite chair at the dining table was untouched, and his keys sat on the kitchen counter. Nothing had been disturbed. It was as if Michael had simply stepped out for a moment, not as if he had left for good. Monroe's questions about Lori's behavior were met with smooth responses. She told him again that Michael had been struggling with personal issues and that he had chosen to leave, giving no further explanation. Yet her answer seemed too rehearsed. Her lack of visible distress, no tears, no signs of panic, made Monroe wonder if Lori had something to hide. The turning point came when Monroe checked Michael's phone records. The last call made from Michael's phone had been to a number that Lori had not mentioned. It was an unlisted number, one that hadn't come up in any of the initial interviews. This sparked a new lead. Monroe tracked the number to a burner phone, which Lori had purchased a week before Michael's disappearance. The detective couldn't ignore the mounting suspicion. Lori's effort to cover her tracks by using a disposable phone was not the action of someone with nothing to hide. As Monroe began to connect the dots, the pieces fell into place. Lori had been acting with a sense of calm that was uncharacteristic for someone whose spouse had vanished. Her financial inquiries, the secretive phone call, and her detached manner, everything suggested that she knew far more than she was letting on. But the biggest breakthrough came when Mark Grayson, Michael's brother, stepped in with crucial information. Mark, who had been skeptical of Lori's version of events from the beginning, handed Monroe a set of documents that Michael had been working on just before his disappearance. It turned out that Michael had been in the process of making changes to his will, potentially cutting Lori out of his estate. The timing was troubling. For Monroe, it was becoming increasingly clear that this wasn't a simple case of a missing person. Something darker was unfolding, and Lori, with her flawless composure, had become the prime suspect. Mark Grayson's suspicion about his sister-in-law, Lori, had never been more evident. From the moment Michael had vanished, he was unconvinced by Lori's calm explanations. The more Lori spoke, the more it seemed as if she were hiding something. Mark, a man who had known Michael for years, couldn't shake the feeling that his brother's disappearance wasn't as simple as Lori was making it out to be. He had always trusted Michael's judgment. The idea that Michael would walk away without a word, leaving behind his belongings and his life, just didn't sit right. The more Lori talked about Michael's supposed depression, the more Mark felt she was trying to justify something. She never once showed the kind of raw grief a wife should feel when her partner vanishes. It wasn't just the lack of tears. It was the absence of panic, of fear. Lori seemed almost relieved. Mark wasn't the only one who noticed. Friends and family began to question Lori's behavior. They had all known Michael as a man who cherished his family and friends, someone who would never simply disappear without reason. His absence left a palpable void. Yet Lori, despite all the questions, remained eerily composed. It was as if the sudden disappearance was nothing more than an inconvenience to her. Determined to get to the truth, Mark began his own investigation. He revisited the house, carefully examining the rooms, searching for anything that might give him a clue. It was in Michael's study that Mark found something odd. Among the paperwork on Michael's desk, he discovered documents that had been hastily shoved into a drawer, papers about Michael's will and financial planning. Mark's hands trembled as he read through the details. It appeared Michael had been considering changes to his estate. Lori had been listed as the primary beneficiary, but there were recent alterations, changes Mark had never been told about. This revelation set off alarm bells in Mark's mind. Why would Michael be making changes to his will just before he disappeared? Had Lori been involved? The idea gnawed at him, pushing him further down a path he wasn't sure he was ready to follow. Mark didn't keep these findings to himself. He shared them with Detective Monroe, who had been investigating the case for weeks. Monroe listened intently, his face a mask of concentration. It was becoming clear that Lori's role in her husband's disappearance was worth a closer look. The detective's growing suspicion mirrored Mark's own feelings, and together they agreed to continue probing into Lori's actions. Meanwhile, Lori's reactions to the investigation were becoming harder to ignore. She'd always been somewhat private, but now her distance felt like a wall, as though she was trying to keep the police and her family at bay. She was evasive when asked about the changes to Michael's will and insisted that everything had been fine between them. But Mark knew better. The evidence pointed to something darker. The situation only became more unsettling when Lori's past began to surface. Neighbors and friends recalled seeing her behave in a strange, almost detached manner in the weeks leading up to Michael's disappearance. One neighbor mentioned how Lori had seemed more focused on rearranging their finances than on worrying about her missing husband. There were whispers about her growing impatience with Michael's struggles, his emotional toll on their marriage. Lori had been overheard on more than one occasion telling friends that she couldn't keep doing this and that things needed to change. Mark now knew what he had to do. He wasn't just going to sit back and wait for answers. He had to take action. If his brother's disappearance had anything to do with Lori's desperation to start over, he was determined to find out. But with every new discovery, the closer he got to a truth he wasn't sure he was ready to confront. Detective Monroe sat at his desk, reviewing the evidence once again. The more he looked at the case, the clearer it became. Lori Shaver had been lying from the start. What was once a case of a missing person had quickly transformed into something darker, and every new detail only strengthened the suspicion that Lori knew far more than she was letting on. Monroe couldn't shake the nagging feeling that Lori's cool composure during the investigation wasn't just a sign of calm, it was a sign of something much more sinister. Her story had remained the same from the beginning, but the inconsistencies were mounting. She claimed Michael had left voluntarily, but every piece of evidence seemed to point toward foul play. The turning point came when Monroe received the results from a recent search of Lori's financial records. Hidden among the transactions was a large sum of money transferred from Michael's account to an offshore bank account, one that Lori had access to. This wasn't just a case of financial management. It was the kind of transaction that suggested something far more calculated. Lori had been preparing for something, and it wasn't just a simple disappearance. As Monroe delved deeper into Lori's past, new information began to surface, unraveling the layers of deception she had carefully built. Lori had been involved in multiple suspicious financial dealings over the past few months. Not only had she been inquiring about Michael's life insurance policy, but there were also multiple instances where she had been caught changing their joint accounts, making her the sole beneficiary of Michael's assets. One detail stood out more than the rest. Lori had recently paid off a significant portion of her debt, something that didn't add up given her previous financial struggles. She had managed to make the payments just before Michael's disappearance. It was a clear sign that Lori had been planning something, and the evidence was beginning to tell a story that was hard to ignore. Mark Grayson, Michael's brother, was becoming more involved in the investigation. He couldn't accept Lori's version of events. Every time he thought about his brother, he was haunted by the same question. How could Michael have left without a word, without even taking his personal belongings? It didn't fit the man he knew. Mark's suspicions grew with each passing day. Monroe's conversations with Mark revealed a disturbing pattern. Mark had always been close to his brother, and he knew Michael well. Michael wasn't the type to walk away from his life. Lori's behavior, her refusal to cooperate with the police, and the sudden change in her financial situation only made things worse in Mark's eyes. Lori's indifference to Michael's disappearance made Mark wonder if she had orchestrated the whole thing. With new leads pointing in Lori's direction, Monroe decided it was time to confront her once again. He needed to get to the bottom of this, and Lori's repeated evasiveness was starting to unravel the story she had so carefully constructed. He set up a meeting at the police station, hoping that her facade would finally crack under pressure. Lori's cold, calculated demeanor remained unchanged as she sat across from Monroe. She insisted that she had no idea where Michael had gone and repeated her earlier claim that he had left on his own accord. But the detective could see the cracks forming. Each time she spoke, her story seemed less believable. She was trying to keep the pieces of her story together, but Monroe was closing in. As the interview continued, Lori's discomfort grew. She was no longer the composed, grieving wife she had presented herself as. There were small signs of panic in her eyes, a nervous shift in her voice, but she fought to maintain control. Yet the harder she tried to hold her ground, the more the web of lies began to collapse. Monroe knew he was on the right track. The pieces were falling into place, and Lori's carefully constructed story was beginning to unravel. But even as the truth became clearer, there was one lingering question that remained. How far had Lori gone to cover her tracks? The more Monroe discovered, the more he realized that Lori's deception was just the tip of the iceberg. Detective Monroe leaned over his desk, sifting through the growing pile of evidence. Despite the progress, something still didn't feel right. Lori's cold indifference, the mounting financial discrepancies, and the witness statements, everything pointed to her, yet there was still a nagging feeling that they were missing something. It was just after midnight when the tip came in. Monroe's phone rang sharply, pulling him from his thoughts. The voice on the other end was jittery, nervous. It was a neighbor who lived 2 streets down from the Shaver household. Someone who had kept quiet until now, but couldn't ignore what they had witnessed the night Michael disappeared. The caller explained they had seen a truck parked behind the Shaver house on the evening Michael went missing. It was an unfamiliar vehicle, a dark-colored van, parked for hours in the shadow of the trees. The neighbor had noticed it, but thought nothing of it at the time. It wasn't until the following morning, when Michael was still missing, that the sighting seemed relevant. The van had been gone by sunrise. The tip wasn't much, but it was enough to lead Monroe to dig further. He immediately called in his team. They traced the van's license plate to a rental agency nearby. The van had been rented in Lori's name, paid for in cash, with no further details about who had driven it. That was the break they needed. Monroe's eyes narrowed as he pieced together the timeline. Lori had been in contact with a rental agency just a few days before Michael's disappearance. She had picked up the van and returned it the morning after. This wasn't the behavior of a wife who believed her husband had left voluntarily. This was someone going to great lengths to hide something. The more Monroe thought about the call, the more unsettling it became. It wasn't just the fact that Lori had rented the van. It was the way she had done it. The lack of paperwork, the secrecy, and the rushed nature of it all painted a clearer picture. Lori wasn't just trying to cover up her husband's disappearance. She was preparing for something far worse. Monroe knew he had to confront her again, but this time, he was ready. He gathered the evidence, the tip, the van rental, and the mounting suspicion about Lori's motives. He would not allow her to spin another story. This time, the truth would come out. The following morning, Monroe walked into the Shaver home with renewed determination. Lori greeted him with a tight smile, her calm exterior betraying no hint of the storm that was beginning to close in around her. "I understand you've been very busy," Lori said coolly, gesturing for him to sit. "Is there any progress? Have you found Michael?" Monroe ignored the question and dove straight into the heart of the matter. "We've been following up on some leads, and we've discovered something that doesn't quite add up," he said, his voice steady. Lori's smile faltered ever so slightly, but she quickly regained control. "What do you mean? What have you found?" Monroe placed a piece of paper on the table. "We've traced the rental van, Lori. You rented it the night Michael disappeared." For a moment, Lori's eyes flickered with something Monroe couldn't quite read. Nervousness, guilt. She quickly recovered, her usual calm returning. "That's absurd," she said, shaking her head. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Funny," Monroe continued, leaning forward, "because we have the records. You rented the van in your name, and you paid for it in cash. The van was at your house the night Michael went missing, and it was gone by the time morning came." Lori's hand twitched slightly. "I don't know what you're trying to imply, Detective," she replied, her voice cool, but her gaze avoided meeting his. "I didn't rent any van." Monroe stood up, not backing down. "You rented the van, Lori. We know it was you, and now we know you had something to hide." He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. "Where is Michael, Lori? What really happened that night?" Lori's face tightened, and for a brief moment, Monroe saw the cracks in her perfect facade. The walls she had so carefully built were crumbling under the pressure. But Lori didn't break. Instead, she stood up, her posture rigid, her voice colder than ever. "I've told you everything I know," she said, her tone clipped. "If you have any more questions, you can speak to my lawyer." Monroe watched her for a moment, silently weighing her words. He knew she wasn't going to give in easily, but now he had enough to push further. Lori was hiding something, and it was only a matter of time before the truth came out. Detective Monroe stood in front of the Shaver home, his mind racing as he thought back to his recent meeting with Lori. She had been evasive, defensive, and most concerning of all, she had refused to explain the mounting evidence against her. The rented van, the financial discrepancies, it all pointed to one conclusion. Lori had been involved in her husband's disappearance, but now the next step was to prove it. The breakthrough came when the tip about the van led Monroe's team to dig deeper into the backyard of the Shaver residence. Lori had been far too calm, far too controlled, for a woman whose husband had supposedly abandoned her. The fact that she hadn't seemed distraught or desperate was starting to make perfect sense. Michael wasn't just missing, he was gone for good, and Lori had known exactly what had happened. With a search warrant in hand, Monroe and his team arrived at the Shaver home to conduct a thorough search of the property. The backyard, which had always been well maintained, suddenly felt ominous. The air was thick with tension as the officers began to dig. The earth, packed and solid, had been disturbed in one particular area, right in the corner of the yard, under the cover of a slab of concrete. As the officers carefully removed the slab, the smell hit them first, stale, pungent, and unmistakable. Monroe's heart raced. He had seen enough crime scenes to know that this wasn't just a misplaced item. This was the evidence they had been looking for. Slowly, as the concrete was lifted, the unmistakable shape of a human body began to emerge from the earth. Michael Shaver's body had been buried beneath the yard all along, hidden in plain sight. Monroe stood frozen for a moment, taking in the sight. There was no way Lori could have not known. She had built a life with Michael. She had shared everything with him. She had to have known what was under that concrete. As the officers worked to unearth the rest of the body, Monroe's thoughts turned to what this discovery meant. Lori's story of a simple disappearance had just shattered. This wasn't just a case of a husband leaving, this was murder. The forensic team arrived swiftly, and the process of uncovering the body continued. Michael's remains were grimly intact, his body showing signs of blunt force trauma. It was clear now, Michael had been killed, and someone had gone to great lengths to cover up the crime. Forensic evidence confirmed the timeline. Michael had died not long after he disappeared, likely within the same week. Lori's meticulous planning to cover up his murder was evident. The concrete slab, the deliberate burial, the care taken to hide the body, it was all part of her calculated attempt to make Michael's disappearance seem like a simple act of leaving. She had thought she had gotten away with it. Monroe couldn't shake the anger that crept into his mind. The image of Lori's calm, unflinching face during their interview flashed before him. How could she have done this? How could someone go so far to cover up such a brutal crime? Her facade had cracked, but now it was too late. The body beneath the concrete was all the evidence they needed to prove that Lori was responsible for her husband's death. As the body was carefully removed from the ground, Monroe's phone rang. It was Mark Grayson, Michael's brother. The grief in Mark's voice was palpable, but it was also mixed with disbelief. Is it really him?" Mark asked, barely able to get the words out. "Yes," Monroe said softly. "It's him. Michael's been found." Mark fell silent on the other end of the line. Monroe could hear the quiet sobs, the painful realization that his brother's life had been stolen in the most brutal of ways. Lori had kept this secret hidden for too long, and now it was out in the open. Monroe stood over the body, knowing that the case was far from over. But now they had what they needed. The truth had finally been uncovered. Michael Shaver's body was no longer buried beneath the earth. It had been brought into the light, and with it, the truth about Lori's role in his death would soon come to the surface. The investigation into Michael Shaver's death had taken a dark turn, but Detective Monroe knew there was still more to uncover. Lori's calm demeanor, her attempts to control the narrative, and the growing pile of evidence all pointed in one direction. She had orchestrated her husband's death. But what Monroe hadn't fully grasped until now was the extent of Lori's manipulation. She had lived a secret life, one that had remained hidden beneath the surface of her seemingly perfect marriage. As Monroe and his team continued to investigate, they began to piece together Lori's actions leading up to Michael's disappearance. There were signs, small but significant, that she had been planning something much larger than just a financial windfall. Lori had not only been hiding money, she had been hiding her entire emotional world, her affairs, and her true intentions. The first real breakthrough came from an unlikely source. Adam Carter, a longtime friend of the Shaver family. Adam had always found Lori to be an enigma. On the surface, she appeared to be the loving wife and doting homemaker. But Adam had always sensed something off. He recalled conversations with Lori where she spoke with growing frustration about her marriage. Michael's emotional struggles had weighed heavily on her, and she had often confided in Adam about her increasing dissatisfaction with their life together. Adam mentioned an encounter that had taken place just a few weeks before Michael's disappearance. Lori had been at a social gathering, and Adam had overheard her speaking with a man, someone he didn't recognize, at the edge of the room. Their conversation had seemed more intimate than just friendly. Lori had been laughing, her demeanor light and flirtatious, in stark contrast to the strained image she often portrayed at home. The man had been someone she had known for a while, and there was something in the way they spoke to each other that struck Adam as more than casual. It wasn't until after the encounter that Adam realized who this man was, someone Lori had been seeing behind Michael's back. This was the secret Lori had been keeping, and it wasn't just an affair, it was the key to understanding her motives. She had found someone who made her feel alive again, someone who offered her the escape she so desperately sought. The affair had started months before Michael's disappearance, and it had given Lori the courage to make the ultimate decision to kill her husband. Monroe, now with this new insight, pressed further into Lori's past relationships. The more he dug, the more he realized that Michael's death wasn't just about financial gain, it was about Lori's need for control, for freedom, and for a new life. She had been emotionally trapped in a marriage that had been suffocating her. Her affair had been her way out, but Michael's unwillingness to simply let her go had forced Lori to take matters into her own hands. Detective Monroe discovered a series of emails between Lori and her lover. They had been discussing plans to escape together, to leave Michigan behind and start fresh. But there was one problem. Michael wasn't going to agree to a divorce. Lori had tried to convince him, but Michael had refused. It wasn't just about the financial stakes. It was about Michael's desire to hold on to a life that was slipping through his fingers. He had clung to the belief that Lori would change, that she would come back to him. In the days leading up to Michael's death, Lori had made her final decision. She couldn't let Michael stand in the way of her new life, so she killed him. She staged his disappearance, burying his body beneath the concrete in the backyard, and continued to maintain the facade of the grieving wife. But even with this revelation, Monroe knew that Lori wasn't going to break easily. She had maintained her composure through everything, and now as the investigation closed in on her, it was clear that Lori was a woman who would go to great lengths to protect the life she had so carefully constructed. For the first time in the case, Monroe felt the weight of the truth hanging in the air. Lori's secret life, her affair, her manipulations, and her brutal actions was no longer a hidden truth. It was out in the open, and there was no way Lori could escape it now. But Lori's final secret remained untouched. The true depth of her deception and the extent of the lengths she would go to in order to maintain control. As the investigation progressed, the pieces of the puzzle finally began to fit together. The more Detective Monroe uncovered, the clearer Lori's motives became. Michael Shaver's death was not just a tragic accident or a disappearance. It was the result of a woman driven by deep dissatisfaction, greed, and a hunger for control over her own life. Monroe spent hours reviewing the evidence. Lori's financial records, her secretive actions, and the revelations from her lover. Every step Lori had taken was now laid bare, and the reasons behind Michael's murder were slowly becoming undeniable. Lori hadn't just killed her husband for the money. There was a deeper emotional trigger. Lori had grown tired of Michael. Her emotional frustration had reached a boiling point. Friends and neighbors recalled how she had frequently complained about Michael's struggles with depression and how he had become a shell of the man she had once married. He was no longer the strong, dependable husband she had known. In Lori's eyes, Michael was a burden, an obstacle in the way of her happiness. And when she met someone new, someone who made her feel alive again, she made a choice. The affair had started innocently enough, a brief escape from the frustration that had been building for months. But as the relationship deepened, Lori realized that her new lover could offer her the freedom she longed for. However, Michael's unwillingness to let go of their marriage and his refusal to divorce her became the catalyst for the violence that followed. Lori had been patient, planning, waiting for the right moment to escape. But when that moment never came, she made a decision. Michael had to go. The idea of a divorce seemed impossible, especially when Lori had seen the financial toll it could take. She had been worried about losing everything she had gained through the marriage, particularly her access to Michael's life insurance. So Lori devised a plan. She would kill Michael, make it look like he had simply walked out on their life together, and then take everything for herself. The life insurance money, the house, the control, everything would be hers. Her careful planning became evident as Monroe and his team pieced together her movements. Lori had been making subtle changes to their financial situation for months. She had quietly been taking control of Michael's finances, ensuring she would be the sole beneficiary. The day before Michael's disappearance, Lori had quietly accessed their joint accounts and transferred large sums of money into her name. The transaction was masked under the guise of personal expenses, but to Monroe it was clear. Lori had been preparing for her new life without Michael, but even more chilling were the details Monroe uncovered from Lori's affair. The messages between Lori and her lover revealed the true nature of her motives. They had spoken of running away together, of escaping the life Lori had grown tired of. She had been living a double life, one where she was the perfect wife in the eyes of the world, and another where she plotted her escape from the man she had once loved. Monroe couldn't help but feel a sense of disgust as he read through the correspondence. Lori had been playing a dangerous game, using Michael's love for her to manipulate him into staying in a marriage that she had already checked out of. The betrayal ran deep, and it wasn't just about the money. Lori's desire for freedom, for a life without the emotional burden of her marriage, had driven her to murder. As the truth unfolded, Monroe knew they had enough to charge Lori with murder, but there was still one piece of the puzzle missing: the confrontation. Monroe needed to sit down with Lori and hear her admit to what she had done. He knew it wouldn't be easy. Lori had already proven to be a master manipulator, but with all the evidence laid out, there was no way she could continue to deny her involvement. In the meantime, Grayson, Michael's brother, was grappling with the revelation of his brother's fate. The grief weighed heavily on him, but with every new detail Monroe uncovered, Mark's anger grew. Lori's betrayal, the lies, the manipulation, it all seemed too much for him to bear. Yet in the face of his pain, Mark found a renewed sense of determination. Michael's death had not been in vain. Lori would be held accountable, and justice would be served. Detective Monroe stood outside the Shaver house, his hand gripping the case file. Everything was in place: the evidence, the testimonies, the undeniable signs that Lori had orchestrated her husband's murder. Yet despite all the proof, there was still one final hurdle: confronting Lori. Monroe had been around long enough to know that even with the strongest case, the arrest was a delicate moment. Lori had been playing the role of the grieving wife for far too long, and now it was time for the truth to come crashing down. It wasn't just about the murder. It was about exposing the extent of Lori's manipulation, her calculated deception, and the chilling coldness with which she had taken Michael's life. Monroe took a deep breath and glanced at the clock. It was time. The arrest wasn't as simple as knocking on the door and reading Lori her rights. She had proven to be more than just a suspect. She was a master manipulator, someone who knew how to control the narrative. Monroe wasn't sure how Lori would react, but he knew she wouldn't go down quietly. Lori had already been on edge after the interviews and the mounting evidence. Monroe could feel the tension in the air as they entered the Shaver home, ready to make their move. Lori greeted them with her usual smile, but there was something different in her eyes, a flicker of fear, of knowing that her carefully constructed world was about to come crashing down. Monroe wasted no time. "Lori, you're under arrest for the murder of your husband, Michael Shaver," he said, his voice steady. "You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." Lori's face didn't change at first. It was as if she had been expecting this moment, as if she had already braced herself for the inevitable. But as the reality of the situation began to sink in, the facade started to crack. She took a step back, her voice shaking as she spoke. "This is a mistake," she said, her eyes darting nervously. "I don't know what you think you found, but this isn't what it seems. Michael, he left me." He chose to go. Monroe shook his head, his resolve firm. We know about the affair, Lori. We know about the financial transactions. And we know you murdered your husband. It's over. For the first time, Lori's composure faltered. Her hands trembled slightly as she reached for her phone, as if she were trying to call someone, perhaps a lawyer or a friend to help her escape. But there was no one left to call. The walls had closed in on her, and she knew it. No, I didn't do this, Lori whispered, her voice breaking. You don't understand. Michael wasn't happy. He was never the same. He didn't love me anymore. He wouldn't let me go. I had no choice. Monroe watched her carefully, listening to her words. It wasn't remorse he heard, but a desperate attempt to justify her actions. She had convinced herself that what she did was somehow necessary, that Michael's death was a form of escape. It was the same reasoning she had used to manipulate everyone around her, to make herself the victim. But Lori was no longer in control. The truth was out, and there was no escaping the consequences of her actions. Mark Grayson, Michael's brother, arrived shortly after the arrest. His face was a mixture of anger, grief, and disbelief. The family had been waiting for this moment for months, but seeing Lori in handcuffs brought a sense of finality to the situation. The woman who had once been a part of their family, the woman who had deceived and betrayed them all, was finally going to face justice. Mark stepped forward, his voice hoarse with emotion. You're the reason my brother is dead. You took him from us, and now you'll pay for it. Lori didn't respond. She simply looked down, her eyes filled with a cold emptiness. There was no apology, no remorse, only the harsh reality of what she had done. As Lori was led out of the house in handcuffs, Monroe couldn't help but reflect on the case. It had started with a simple missing persons report, but it had turned into something far darker. Lori's lies, her manipulation, her cold, calculated actions, everything had been part of a plan that had ultimately cost Michael Shaver his life. But now the truth was finally out. Lori had been exposed for who she truly was. The wheels of justice were in motion, and there would be no more hiding behind her carefully constructed mask. The courtroom was filled with an air of tension, thick with the weight of anticipation. Lori Shaver sat in the defendant's chair, her hands clasped tightly in front of her, her expression an unreadable mask. She had spent the last few months in jail, but this moment, the trial, was where the truth would finally be exposed for everyone to see. Her fate now rested in the hands of 12 strangers, but Lori had always been a master at controlling her image. For weeks, the public had been fed the narrative of a wife who had tragically lost her husband. But the truth, the brutal, unforgiving truth, was finally being told. Lori had killed Michael. She had lied, manipulated, and schemed her way through every stage of the investigation. Now the full extent of her crimes would be revealed in open court. The prosecution wasted no time in laying out the case. Detective Monroe took the stand, his testimony a damning recount of everything they had uncovered. He spoke of the financial transactions, the rental van Lori had used to conceal Michael's murder, and the damning evidence of her affair. He told the jury how Lori had planned everything with cold precision, burying her husband's body in their backyard under a slab of concrete, making sure it stayed hidden for months. As Monroe spoke, Lori's eyes never left him. She seemed detached, emotionless, almost as if she were listening to someone else's story, not her own. Her lawyer tried to object to some of the details Monroe presented, but the evidence was overwhelming. It didn't take long for the jury to understand the full scope of Lori's betrayal. But the most heart-wrenching moment came when Mark Grayson, Michael's brother, took the stand. Mark had been the first to suspect Lori, the first to call attention to the inconsistencies in her story. He spoke of the pain he had felt when his brother disappeared, the frustration of not knowing what had happened. And now, as he stood in front of the jury, Mark spoke with a raw, grief-stricken honesty. I don't understand how she could do this, Mark's voice cracked, the pain evident in every word. My brother didn't deserve this. He didn't deserve to die like that. Lori was supposed to be his wife. She was supposed to love him. The words hit Lori like a slap in the face. For the first time in the trial, her composure faltered. She looked down at the table in front of her, her face a mask of cold defiance, but her fingers trembled slightly. The defense tried to argue that Lori had acted out of desperation, that she had been overwhelmed by Michael's struggles with depression and their failing marriage. They painted her as a woman pushed to the brink, a victim of her circumstances. But the jury wasn't buying it. Lori's actions were deliberate, and her lack of remorse made it clear that she had never seen herself as a victim. As the trial progressed, more damning evidence was presented. The affair Lori had been involved in was brought up, and the jury learned how Lori had been planning to escape with her lover, using Michael's life insurance money to start a new life. Lori's desire for freedom, for a life without the burden of Michael's depression, had driven her to murder. By the time closing arguments were made, the case was clear. The prosecution had proven, beyond a reasonable doubt, that Lori Shaver had killed her husband. There was no ambiguity, no question left unanswered. Lori had been a woman trapped by her own desires, willing to do anything to escape the life she had grown tired of. As the jury deliberated, Lori sat in silence, her future uncertain. She had been able to manipulate those around her for so long, but in this moment, there was no escape. The truth had been laid bare, and now she would have to face the consequences of her actions. Mark Grayson sat in the courtroom, waiting for the verdict. His mind raced with thoughts of his brother, of how Michael had been taken from him in such a brutal, senseless way. He wanted justice, but he knew it wouldn't bring Michael back. Still, it was the only thing that could provide some sense of closure. The jury returned to the courtroom, and as they took their seats, Monroe watched Lori closely. Her face was stoic, but he could see the tension in her shoulders, the way her hands gripped the edge of the table. The moment had come. The foreman of the jury stood, and the courtroom fell silent. We, the jury, find the defendant, Lori Shaver, guilty of first-degree murder. Lori's face didn't change. She was silent, emotionless, as the words hung in the air. For Mark, it was a moment of bitter relief. His brother's death had not been in vain. Lori would pay for what she had done, but the pain, the grief would linger long after the verdict was read. The courtroom was quieter than usual as the judge read aloud Lori Shaver's sentence. There was a sense of finality, a weighty silence that hung in the air. The verdict had been clear, first-degree murder, and now Lori was about to face the consequences of her actions. The truth had come to light, and justice, in its cold, unforgiving manner, was about to be served. Lori, sitting in her chair, appeared almost stoic. Her eyes were focused on the floor, her expression unreadable, but anyone who had followed the trial closely could see the subtle signs of tension in her stiff posture, the slight tremor in her hands. She had played the role of the grieving wife for so long, but now that facade was gone. Lori was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Her cold, calculated actions had led to her downfall. For months she had deceived everyone around her, making them believe her story of a husband who had simply disappeared. But the truth was undeniable now. She had murdered Michael, and no amount of denial could change that fact. Mark Grayson, Michael's brother, was in the courtroom that day. His grief had been evident throughout the trial, but now as the judge delivered the sentence, Mark felt a strange sense of relief. The justice his brother had been denied in life was finally being served. Lori would pay for what she had done to Michael and to their family, but relief was not the same as closure. Michael was still gone. No sentence could bring him back, no matter how much time Lori spent behind bars. The pain of losing a loved one under such violent circumstances lingered, a wound that could never truly heal. Mark had fought for justice, had watched as the truth about Lori's actions came to light, piece by piece. And while the trial had been difficult, seeing her convicted was the first step toward finding some kind of peace. It wasn't a happy ending. It wasn't the resolution he had hoped for when Michael first disappeared. But it was justice, and it was something. Lori, for all her manipulation and control, was now powerless. The finality of the sentence was a crushing blow to the carefully constructed world she had built. She had been in control for so long, but now she faced the consequences of her choices. The affair, the lies, the murder, they had all led her here. As the bailiff approached to escort her out of the courtroom, Lori's eyes briefly flickered up to meet Mark's. There was no apology, no recognition of the pain she had caused. Lori was not a woman to show remorse. Her eyes were cold, defiant, unchanged. For Mark, the moment was bittersweet. He knew that Lori's sentence wouldn't undo the years of pain, the absence of his brother, the weight of his grief. But it was a step forward. Michael had been taken from them in the most brutal of ways, but at least now Lori could no longer hide behind her lies. The truth had come out, and the justice system had done what it was meant to do. Lori was led out of the courtroom, her back straight, her head held high, as if she were still in control of her own fate. But Mark knew better. She may have believed she had won, but she had only ensured her own destruction. Michael's death had not been in vain. Lori would pay for the life she had stolen from him. As Mark walked out of the courthouse, he felt the weight of the years of anguish lift, just slightly. There would never be true closure, but in that moment with the sentence handed down, he knew that his brother's story, Michael's story, would not be forgotten. The truth had come to light, and justice had been served. What do you think of Lori Shaver's actions? Was she justified in her decisions, or was the pursuit of freedom and money the driving force behind her brutal actions? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the case, don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more shocking true crime stories. Stay tuned for our next video.